outside of Philadelphia as well. One of the things that we talk about every 4 years is the lack of young people participating in the voting process. We seem to always hone in on subject matter such as student loans and the economy. But how do we engage young people to be lifetime voters? We didn't have social media when we were younger. And I grew up in a house where we did speak politics at the dinner table. However, how do we make the connection that what happens on the other side of the world is not just student loans, it's not just the economy, it's a myriad of things that have an effect that affects their community. How do we get them to buy in?
So one of the reasons for All In, the Fight for Democracy, was a conversation I had with a young person who worked on my campaign. We had unprecedented youth participation. We increased youth participation in the 2018 election by 139%. And that was across all racial spectrums. And this was when we considered youth anyone below the age of 30. One of the ways we were able to engage them was that we actually resourced them. We gave them money and we said, look, come up with an idea. If it's a good idea, we'll fund it. And that helped change the dynamic. But this conversation I was having was with one of our key lieutenants. And we were talking about, this was in 2019, we were having a conversation about what was happening in Florida and the retrenchment by Governor DeSantis against the returning citizens and Amendment 4. And she said, why do they keep calling something a poll tax? There's probably a sexier way to describe it. And I said, what do you mean a sexier way to describe it? She's like, I mean, what is a poll tax anyway? No one knows what that means. We need to come up with a better way to describe what's happening. And it hit me like a ton of bricks. When you and I were growing up, when most of us who were involved in politics were growing up, you were either in the civil rights movement or you're children of the civil rights movement. We have an entire 2 generations that are removed from what the movement was about and what the lexicon was. And so part of the reason for the film is to connect the dots from what began as voter suppression and what we currently has seen manifested, particularly for young people. That voter suppression doesn't just target people of color, it intentionally targets young people. We see this in Texas with the fact that Texas and Georgia. Texas, where you can use your gun license but not your student ID. Georgia, where a state-issued student ID is considered invalid for the purposes of voting, but perfectly valid for the purposes of taking your money. In New Hampshire, where they rewrote the laws because they were afraid too many students were going to vote in the 2020 election. And Florida, where they shut down on-campus polling places, arguing there wasn't enough parking. And so part of the responsibility is that we have to recognize that voting doesn't operate in a vacuum. We have seen a decimation of civic education over the last 20 years because of the push for education to be about rote learning as opposed to internalizing and actually growing your mind. We have seen the adoption by so many of us who understand the civil rights movement. We watched Eyes on the Prize in part because all we had was PBS. They don't have to, so they don't see it. And so we can't see these things in isolation. We have to see them of a piece. But then that means also tying what those movements meant to what they are facing today. Because young people, regardless of race, care about the environment. They care about jobs. They care about criminal justice reform. They care about whether they have bodily autonomy. And we have to do the education we have to do it in hindsight, because we've got to explain now that the connective tissue. If you don't want to be charged with a crime and you face 6 years where someone with the same exact crime faces 6 months, you got to vote on district attorneys. If you want to see justice for Breonna Taylor or Ahmaud Arbery, then we've got to have judges who actually pay attention. And if you want to be on those grand juries making those decisions, you've got to register to vote. And so part of our responsibility, and what I see as one of the goals of All In, is that we've got to do the teaching that has unfortunately left so many of these young people out of the conversation. So it's not just about the issues or the process, it's connecting the dots and being intentional about it. Because when we are intentional, we actually do see dramatic increases in participation. And I would just say, go look at the streets where protests are happening. If we do more than simply say, just go vote, if we say protest in the streets and then protest at the ballot boxes and connect those dots, we will continue to see a rise in youth participation in our elections.
Thank you so much. And thank you for all your